I think it was at the tail end of last year, for the first time, the West assessed that Russia was losing more people than it could recruit. Putin will be stroking his cat on his lap, a bit like one of the baddies in the Bond films, and just saying, keep doing what you're doing, was to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. If President Trump was to give long-range weapons to Ukraine, it would tilt the war in Ukraine's favour and would make life very difficult for President Putin. So why doesn't he do it? If you wanted to solve this problem long-term, Iran can't, and say that Iran can't do this again, you've got to invade Iran. So I'm going to be 100 miles away from my Russian adversary. He's not even going to know I'm there. And there's a missile in the sky heading his way. Your nation's enemies have to be deterred from, and to do that, your nation's enemies have to believe that you would use the weapon. So I've got to stand there looking you in the eye, and you've got to believe that I would press that button.
To speak with you in London, and let's begin our session with Ukraine and Iran. Iran has warned Ukraine that its territory will become a legitimate target if it helps the U.S. and Israel to provide better protection against Iranian Shaheed drones. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is sending military experts to the Middle East to help Gulf nations to provide better protection against Iranian drones. How does the war in Iran influence the war in Ukraine? And does this get President Zelensky more cards in its relations with U.S.?
Well, there is a simple question, but it's a very complicated answer, I suspect. I think if you were to try to condense it down into a one-liner, it would be that the war in Iran is not helpful to Ukraine. There are some positives, but there are also a number of negatives. Let's cover some of the negatives first. Smart weapons, whether that be Patriot missile systems or bombs or missiles, there are not big supplies of those around the world, and it takes quite a long time for industry to generate new weapons. Now, the Americans have always had big stockpiles of weapons, but if you look at the rates that they are using those up at the moment in Iran, I think I heard there were 8,000 targets had been struck, and this was a day or two ago. Each of those targets, probably 2 bombs each time. Phenomenal number of weapons being used. So an industry can't keep pace with that. I did some analysis on some of the Patriot missile systems, and I think they produce 17 a week. That's what they can produce. People are using a lot more than that at the moment. So will America continue to sell weapons to Europe to be able to give them to Ukraine? I think it'll become more difficult. It's also more difficult because a central pillar of Europe's strategy to support Ukraine is sanctions against Russia. It's trying to put pressure on the Russian economy so that President Putin finds himself gradually being sucked into a situation where domestically it's very difficult for him. But President Trump has just, on his own, just lifted those sanctions of Putin's oil. And as I understand it, Putin is now making another $150 million a day profit that he wasn't making before. All of that, I think, demonstrates that President Trump has one priority here, and that is President Trump. And if the war in Iran doesn't go his way, he will be looking to blame Europe for not helping him, and President Zelensky is probably going to suffer as a result of that.
We will cover the war in Iran, but let's more focus also on Ukraine war, and there are a few milestones which were reached. Russia has lost 1.2, 1.3 million soldiers dead and wounded, Also, Russia's war against Ukraine has now lasted longer than Soviet Union's war against Nazi Germany during the Second World War. How can you assess Russia's position on the ground and Russia's success in terms of achieved and not achieved military objectives?
Yeah, I know when you and I talk about this, I get criticized because I sound downbeat. I sound
pessimistic, right?
Yeah, and I apologize for that. But I am a grey-haired military analyst that has spent a lot of time on operations. And I don't think it's helpful to provide a sugar-coated, a positive spin. Our Ministry of Defence, when I get briefed regularly, tend to focus on the positives. They tend to focus on the fact that Russia is struggling to take any more ground, that its economy is hurting, that it's lost a lot of soldiers. But the reality on the ground is that Russia is still moving forward. It's slow, it's incredibly costly for Russia, but it is still moving forward. And it's no secret that Ukraine is struggling to find the people to keep feeding that fight. Now, that's the half empty, that's the downside. The positive side is that I think it was at the tail end of last year, for the first time, the West assessed that Russia was losing more people than it could recruit. And that is really interesting because Russia, under Yevgeny Prigozhin, was using the Wagner group of convicts. Then he was pulling people in from North Korea. Then he was pulling people from around the world, promising them large amounts of money, but saying you won't get deployed to the front line. But as soon as they arrived in Russia, they were sent straight through to the front line. That was all very short term. Now, people have recognized they may get paid well, but they won't live to enjoy spending that money. So, and the economy for Russia, although the lifting of oil sanctions isn't helpful, but it's still making life increasingly difficult for President Putin. So the real question is, what is Russia actually seeking to achieve? If it keeps grinding on, it is more likely that it will be vulnerable to a Ukrainian clever counterattack somewhere. And President Putin will not want that to happen. And if I was President Putin's military advisor at the moment, which I like to sort of sit there, I think I'd be saying to him, Putin will be stroking his cat on his lap, a bit like one of the baddies in the Bond films, and just saying, keep doing what you're doing. You wanted to tackle NATO. Well, NATO seems to be falling apart at the moment. You wanted to make Russia great again, and actually you are making progress. And it may be messy, it may be taking a lot longer than you wanted to, but President Trump doesn't look like he wants to get involved and stop you. And European leaders still look as if they're trying to find a solution without getting their hands dirty. So I think this summer will be really critical because I can't speak for Russia, but if they are planning a big major offensive, I think that might create some really interesting challenges for Ukraine. It'll also create some opportunities for Ukraine. Because as a military guy, if you want to do a major offensive, you have to bring your forces together to push in one area. If you pull your forces together, you leave yourself vulnerable. And of course, with the West's eyes and ears watching over the battlefield, then it's quite possible that Russia will leave itself vulnerable. But yeah, that's a long way of saying, at the moment, Russia is still moving forward, and that's not a good sign.
You also just mentioned about Russia's recruitment problems. This is right information that they lost more soldiers than they were able to recruit and get to the fight. Moreover, according to U.S. Institute of Study of War, Ukraine regained more territories than it lost in late February 2026 for the first time since this counteroffensive in 2023. Don't you think that these dynamics don't look great for Russia, for long war, for attrition?
Well, okay, so I agree with the headlines you've just quoted about that Ukraine took back territory. But if you look what it took back, the Institute of Studies of War is very clear that villages and towns have strategic value. Fields do not. And if you start linking up villages that Russia has taken and all of the fields around them, it looks like a big area. This was actually more of a mopping up operation by Ukraine. I'm not trying to undermine it. I think it's fantastic, but it wasn't of any strategic value. And as you know, when forces are moving forward, as Russia is doing, initially they're very vulnerable because they haven't dug their trenches. They don't have their supply lines. They don't have the communications laid. So the best time to do a counterattack is straight after the attack of your enemy because they're not settled in. And my understanding is that quite a lot of the territory was just retaken quickly. Now, again, I think that's a really positive thing. It demonstrates that Ukraine is not just walking backwards, it's also walking forwards. But again, you know that the side on the offense generally loses a lot more people than the team on the defense, because defensively, you're in your trenches, looking out over the top, firing at anything that comes towards you. If you're on the offense, you have to get out of your trench and you have to charge at the enemy. You leave yourself very vulnerable. And Russian blockade forces will shoot the Russian soldiers if they turn around and run back. So you end up with very large casualties. If Ukraine was to go on the offensive and start to push Russia out, unless they cause a rout when Russia soldiers just run away, it actually could be very costly for Ukraine. And that's why there's a lot of military analysis that says the outcome of the war, if one of the outcomes is Ukraine pushes Russian soldiers out of all of Ukraine and Crimea, that's very, very unlikely to happen because Ukraine just doesn't have the soldiers to do that. If it was pushing the soldiers out of all of Ukraine, but not Crimea, again, a very large area, very difficult to do. If it was to stop Russia and maybe push it back a bit, that would almost certainly stop President Putin because he wouldn't want to risk losing all the territory that he had gained. And therefore, Ukraine might be able to create a line in the sand and somehow get the international community to provide those security guarantees to make sure Russia couldn't go any further. Now, how would you then get that territory back? That's a conversation for another day, because it's very difficult to see militarily given the relative sizes, the relative strength. But as President Zelensky has said many times, and I think you and I have talked about, the priority is to stop the war. Another priority is to get the territories back, but the first priority is to stop the war and make sure that Russia can't come at Ukraine again. And I think that is something the international community has been looking very carefully at to see how it can help Ukraine. And I've seen quite a lot of advanced planning for that. Whether that includes America heavily or not, I don't know. But as soon as you put European soldiers in Ukraine to help deter Russia, I think that provides some pretty robust guarantees. We'll have to see.
While we're talking about possible security guarantees after the war ends, after the fighting ends, if Vladimir Putin does not want to end the war. He rejects all offers proposed by President Trump. Does this make any kind of sense, future planning for 10, 15 years?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it, as to, at the moment, again, if I was looking at this through Russia's lens, why would I stop? In fact, he has offered to stop if you give up the rest of the Donbass. Because I think Putin is confident that he will eventually take Kramatorsk and the remaining cities of the Donbass. But it might take him a couple more years to do it. I think that's what he believes. If he also believes that President Trump wants the war to stop and will force President Zelensky into doing a deal, why on earth would President Putin even hint that he wants to stop the war? Because he will be wanting to get everything he can out of this. And at the moment, he'll believe he's in a very strong position. He'll believe he's in a strong position because he will believe that he can take the rest of the Donbass in a couple of years. He also believes that President Trump is more favorable to Putin than he is to Zelensky. And whilst he believes that, why would he negotiate? Why would he stop?
Do you feel that he is in a strong position? Maybe this is also about performance and he would like to pretend to be in a strong position at home and abroad.
Well, I'm not sure he's in a strong position, but I think he believes he is. My worry here is that President Trump, I just can't quite understand why the American president has blamed Volodymyr Zelensky for the war, why he blames Zelensky for not doing a deal, surrendering. He doesn't understand, and I don't understand why. Because if President Trump was to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, if President Trump was to give long-range weapons to Ukraine, it would tilt the war in Ukraine's favor and would make life very difficult for President Putin. So why doesn't he do it? And I'm worried that some of the answer to that is that he believes that European countries have been freeloading on America under NATO for many years, that he believes that America, their new national security strategy in America talks about America first, talks about the Western Hemisphere. And it explains why Trump went into Venezuela. It explains why Trump was threatening Denmark over Greenland. And if Trump, who no longer sees China as the enemy, but China as the Eastern Hemisphere is China's, then all of a sudden, America, Western Hemisphere, China, Eastern Hemisphere, this Middle Earth becomes a fight between Russia and Europe. Why would America get involved in that? It's not my fight. And my worry is that I sort of can understand that, but what I don't understand is why he then blames Zelensky for being the one who's been invaded by another country, but blaming him for not resolving it. So all of those things, I think, contribute to President Putin feeling emboldened at the moment.
You just mentioned about Tomahawk missiles. We have been hearing these discussions for a while about specific type of equipment Ukraine really needs, but would several Tomahawk missiles really change the game of this war?
Well, I think the question is, what would change the game in the war? And I've spent quite a while talking to military colleagues about this. And I think part of it is that if you look back to the start of this war, and it's difficult to cover it in a few sound bites, but the 40-mile convoy approaching Kyiv, Russian military might against a small country like Ukraine. I don't think the West ever really expected Ukraine to be able to withstand that initial Russian onslaught. But you did. Your courage, your professionalism, your tenacity, your sacrifice did. But the West then had to work out, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, so why should we get involved? Because we don't want to fight with Russia. And it took a long time before we agreed to provide anti-tank weapons. And then some time later, after lots of, I'm not sure, we gave tanks. So the UK, Challenger 2s, we offered those, and eventually the Leopards were offered. Later than that, we started offering long-range missiles like Storm Shadow. And it was another period of a year or so before we provided F-16s. If you look back, if only we'd made those decisions rather quicker, would the war's outcome have been different? And if you look at today through that same lens, if the war goes on for a year, 2 years, 3 years more, what else will we do that if we did now and not in 3 years' time would help make the difference? And for me, one of the big changes has been that when Russia initially invaded, it wasn't really our war. It was on the European continent, but it didn't feel like our war. Now that America feels like it's walking away from NATO, now that it feels like Russia is emboldened, now that we look more closely at how much military capability the West has in Europe, individual countries, I think the Russian threat is now not just a threat to Ukraine, but also a threat to Europe. Now, you'd probably say to me, we've been telling you that from the start. And I'd agree with you, but I do think our politicians are starting to feel it more. I was supporting an event in the Polish embassy last week. They feel the heat of Russia's invasion, not only through the lens of history, but also today. And that's why they're spending money, they're developing capability, they're working with the Ukrainians to understand the lessons you have learned. I don't think this country feels the heat quite the same way. But now that with America wobbling on NATO, I think we're seeing a lot more conversations at the senior political and military level going, we can't just watch and let Ukraine lose. Of course we're not doing that. But what more could we do? And I think things like air power, providing a no-fly zone, things like long-range missiles, not putting combatants in, but I think there are ways in which we could change the threat that Putin sees, because he knows what Ukraine has. He knows what your limits are. He knows that you have fewer soldiers than he does, and therefore he just wants a grinding war of attrition because he will win if that happens. The more the West was providing technology, I think that would just move the dial a bit and potentially create some interesting opportunities, specifically if Ukraine was to be able to mount a surprise attack on Crimea, for example, and threaten taking Crimea back. I think that will be a strategic disaster for President Putin. If he even thought that that was possible, I think he'd be looking over his shoulder going, hang on a minute, we need to start negotiating because I can't afford to lose Crimea. That is, for all sorts of historical reasons and strategic reasons, it's really important. So it's a long answer, but I do think the West now feels more that this is not just a threat to Ukraine, it's a threat to Europe, in which case, what do we need to do about it?
Should NATO members have closed the sky over Ukraine since the day one of this war? Should have they joined this war in 2022? Would this make a difference?
Well, it would have made a difference. I've no doubt about that. Western air power, Russia has no answer to Western air power. So I think it would have made a difference. I, as an older military guy, I think I leave it to the historians to decide what might or might not have been done and what the consequences might have been. As a military guy, I tend to look at now and look forward. I can't change what's happened. What we have to do is learn the lessons from what's happened to influence what we do into the future. When this war is over, I think it will be a very good opportunity to look back and decide, you know, we have given a lot of missiles, we have given tanks, we have given F-16s. If they had been given earlier, would that have created an opportunity for Ukraine to do different things? Possibly, yes. Would that have changed the outcome of the war? Who knows? That's for academics to decide. And also, even today, I mean, my last visit to Ukraine, I was talking to some of the guys flying your F-16s. We operate in the West our aircraft very differently than Ukraine operates them. You don't have an independent air force, so your army units hang on to your aircraft and use them in a very different way than an independent air force like ours, like the Americans, operate. And there is a view that the F-16 could offer some really interesting opportunities for Ukraine if it was to be used in a certain way, rather than being the way it is. But to be brutally honest, it's not my war, it's your war. You have some incredibly brave and professional people fighting, and it's not for us to tell you how to fight a war. But we do use our resources and our assets in a different way than you are used to. And I do think that's where there would be the opportunity to create real advantage for Ukraine.
Let's cover really interesting air power topic, drone warfare. Now we are watching closely these developments in the Middle East when U.S. Army intercepts cheap Iranian Shaheed drones using so costly, expensive Patriot missiles and other expensive anti-aircraft missile. What kind of lessons should be learned from this experience of Ukraine and U.S. in the Middle East? From your perspective, how can you assess this performance of U.S. military in intercepting such cheap Iranian Shaheed drones? Were they were prepared for this?
Yeah, you can imagine I've been quite busy on interviews over the last 18 days of the war, and this is one of the questions that crops up regularly. First of all, everybody in the military I speak to says that they're not using Patriots to shoot down Shaheed drones. But the principle that we are using fighter jets, using air-to-air missiles, which are still £500,000 a missile to shoot down a cheap drone. What is interesting, I think, is people get fixated about the cost. Many of the Middle East countries are not short of money. They don't care how these things are shot down. They don't care if it's £10 or £1 million. What they care about is the safety and the security of their people on the ground. But the real issue here is that the West has largely invested in technology to stop it getting dragged into wars of attrition. Technology costs money, and therefore you can afford fewer missiles. The more clever they are, the fewer you can afford. And what we're finding in the war in Iran is that Iran has recognized that American quality can be combated with quantity. Because a Shaheed drone, put a different sensor on the front of it, you fire 10 at an American warship, all will get shot out of the sky. You fire 100, no, let's say 1,000 at the American warship, First of all, it can't track that many at once. And secondly, it runs out of missiles. The British warship that we've just seen, HMS Dragon, one of our Type 45 platforms, very capable. But I think it only has 20 of the missiles that can shoot down those drones. So as soon as 21 are fired at it, now it has got other ways of protecting itself. That's not the only way of protecting itself. But my point being is that Iran has very effectively, we believe it's still got over 70,000 Shaheed drones and lots of FPV drones and the like. And I think what has been quite strange is that as we sit here, President Zelensky has been in London, and we understand that there are a number of Ukrainians who have drone expertise that have taken that to the Gulf to help the Gulf neighbours better combat, use that expertise to stop these Shaheeds. Now, initially I went, how does Ukraine, you're fighting a war. But I think this is a really shrewd move by President Zelensky because he needs help in the war. He needs money. He needs weapons. The Middle East has money and weapons but needs expertise. And I think President Zelensky will have created a lot of goodwill amongst those Middle East countries. They'll be more inclined to try to help him now in the battle against Russia. And also, one of the events I talked about it with the Polish embassy, that was all about how the Polish learning about how Ukraine are battling with drones. And also, we don't think we'll have the same war that Ukraine is having with Russia. But actually, rather than having drones that are literally carrying a hand grenade around and delivering it through a window, if you actually think of drones as nodes in a battle space ecosystem, so those nodes now all feed in information, so create a much more detailed picture of the battle space. Some of those drones might be watching, some of them may be listening, some of them may be listening on radio, some of them may be jamming. Now all of a sudden you're creating, these drones aren't just flying around and blowing things up, they're how you control the battle space. I used to fly close air support aircraft, fighter jets. Why would you use fighter jets to do close air support in the future when actually you might be able to do it all using drones? So I think there's some really interesting lessons that come out. But there's no doubt at all that the expertise that your people have gained in Ukraine fighting Shaheeds is now being translated. And there is some expertise that we have in this country that can take out Shaheed drones for a fraction of the price of a missile. A lot of that capability is now being deployed quickly to the region as well.
However, US President Donald Trump says that he doesn't need any kind of support from Ukraine. He doesn't need European allies. He doesn't need NATO to help him to solve his problem, right? To unblock the Strait of Hormuz. Is he right?
So I was in the military for a long time, and regularly you'd have to work out where were your main threats. So Russia and China were our main threats. And you would war game how a war against Russia, how a war against China might be fought. What would be the role of America? What equipment, what capability, how many ships, how many tanks, how many airplanes, and that would feed what shape your military was made. And we used to war game what happened if there was a war against Iran. And indeed, I have played Iran sometimes in those war games. It was inevitable, because every time I did the war game, Iran got beaten up militarily. It has no answer to American military might. But every time it came down to the Straits of Hormuz, because that is a natural choke point where 20% of the world's oil and more of the world's natural gas go through. And as soon as you stop the flow of trade there, it has international implications. So this outcome was entirely predictable. The US military would have war gamed, would have known that from the start. So the question is, did President Trump even listen to his military advice at the time? Because what looks increasingly likely is that he didn't, that he thought he'd be able to go in to Iran the way that they went into Venezuela, pluck Maduro, end of story. And the normal way that these things happen is our military pull our politicians aside. What is your strategic objective? Military is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So the military will do their job, providing you go the day after, what are you going to do? Listening to Trump talk, it's very difficult to work out what his strategic objectives were. Was it regime change? Well, they delivered that on day one. They severed the leadership of all of the Ayatollah Khamenei and all his family and all of the seniors. But they didn't stop. Was it to stop Iran ever developing a nuclear weapon? Well, you can set their program back a day, a week, a month, or a year, but intent is this. You can't stop them wanting to do it. They can't unlearn what they have learned. So the question is, what is this continued military campaign actually aiming to achieve? Because the Straits of Hormuz, you can't easily solve that with military means. So it has to be political dialogue. And it doesn't look like President Trump's got any appetite for that. So I'm not entirely clear, and I'm not even sure President Trump is entirely clear what his outcome is. I think he thought that there would be an uprising the moment America bombed Tehran. I know some Iranian folks. There's a young lady, Tara, who works in Sky, and she said, you fail to understand the Iranian people if that's what you think is going to happen. They've got no guns, they've got no weapons, they've been slaughtered the last time they jumped up. The regime's still in place, maybe different people, but it's still there. So to expect the people to rise up is naive. So now you've got a situation where President Trump's trying to get the international community in. They're going, hang on a minute, you broke it, you fix it. And Trump's recognizing, I think, that it's a lot easier to start a war than it is to end it.
Has President Trump lost control over this war?
I'm not sure he's lost control, but even on the end of the first day, President Trump was telling everybody that we won. We've won already. End of day one, we've won. And I think what he's been seduced is by the military story. There's no doubt that the US military dominates Iranian military. The Iranians' air defenses have been rolled back. American air power can operate wherever it likes over Iran. Iran's got no answer. America can strike targets on the surface or below the surface or above the surface whenever they like. And therefore, America's been making films demonstrating, showing off what they can do. So militarily, I'm sure they'd say that was a great success. But strategically, has that military action delivered the outcomes that President Trump wanted? And the answer plainly is no. President Trump's claiming that the Iranians are now just looking for a way out and want to negotiate. The Iranian president was saying, we don't want to negotiate. When America's finished and apologized to us, then maybe we'll stop. So I don't think time is not on President Trump's side. Neither is the supply of weapons. And therefore, I think the balance at the moment is tipping away from America and towards Iran. And there's a grave risk, I think, that this will come to define President Trump's presidency. Excuse me.
From your perspective, can U.S. really win this war?
What do you think win means?
For example, unblock the Strait of Hormuz, the most difficult problem for President Trump.
So we don't have time on this podcast to look at in the detail, but let me tell you that you either do that by putting a convoy together and destroyer ships that provide a shield for that convoy, and that you comb the sea for mines, and you hope that none of your ships will be targeted. If you look at the number of ships that go through the Straits of Hormuz, the size of the ships, the vulnerability of the ships, the number of military ships available, it's an incredibly dangerous operation. There is no doubt that some of the ships will be hit. And an environmental disaster would ensue. I don't think that's, you might decide, well, we'll accept that a few tankers get blown up, but the rest will get through. The tanker wars, I think it was back in the late 1980s, there were 4 years worth, but I think it was over 400 merchant ships were targeted in that time. You just can't see the appetite of America doing that. So that's not feasible. If you wanted to solve this problem long term, Iran can't, and say that Iran can't do this again, you've got to invade Iran. You've got to annex a large part of Iran that's next to the Straits of Hormuz and either side of it. A belt of land so that you control the territory on the far side of the Straits of Hormuz. That would permanently solve the problem, but you'd put a lot of boots on the ground to do that. Boots on the ground is a long-term commitment. They would be targeted. There would be US casualties. And President Trump got elected under the banner that he's the president of peace, that I've solved all these wars. I don't think there'd be very much, if any, public support in America for that sort of footprint of Trump getting America with its fingers firmly in the mangle. That's very difficult to see an outcome. So I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but most of my military colleagues think what will happen is that President Trump will wake up one morning, declare victory, and walk away from the withdraw his forces and walk away.
Has this war revealed U.S. Military weaknesses?
I think it has, yes. I mean, well, we've got to be careful here. It's a bit like saying, is the war in Ukraine, is that the way that wars are going to be fought in the future? No, it's not. I think the question is, can air power alone deliver the objectives that President Trump was seeking to achieve? And the answer is plainly no. Air power, it allows you to surgically strike your enemy's capability. It minimizes the risk of your casualties on your own side. And you can be very measured, but also brutal in the way that you conduct the war. But unless you put boots on the ground, you don't have enduring effect. And I think most military scholars know the lessons of history that you can't do this without putting boots on the ground. And therefore, if you know you haven't got the appetite to put boots on the ground, then don't do it. And this goes back to, I'm pretty confident that the American military, they are a very, very professional, capable bunch of individuals. They run the biggest military power in the world. They can do anything. They will have wargamed this. They will know exactly what was going on. So I think the real question is that President Trump must have ignored the advice to him. So now they're going to be working out how do you extract yourself from this? And I think that's the trick for Trump. So yes, has it exposed the limits of American air power? Yes. But I wouldn't underestimate the awesome military might that America has. And if it was to put boots on the ground and involve its navy properly, there's no nation in the world that can stop it. But appetite for casualties. Afghanistan taught America. Vietnam taught America. Nobody has an appetite for that unless it's a war of national survival. And this is not a war of national survival.
U.S. has used years' worth of key munitions, including Tomahawk missiles, during this war. From your perspective, does this sound sustainable? And can U.S. fight different wars simultaneously, for example, against Iran, against China? If Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan, would American soldiers be ready?
Yeah. I think one of the things that... Let's look at my country first. So the UK. We looked at certain wars that we were prepared to fight. And we made some assumptions about how long they'd last for, and therefore how many weapons we would need to last. The war in Ukraine and now the war in Iran have demonstrated that we were horribly wrong, that actually we had nowhere near enough weapons. We had good capabilities in ships, tanks and aeroplanes, but the weapons stockpiles, not even close. America, I think, has always spent a lot more, not only in terms of the billions of dollars. I think it's a $1.5 trillion budget that's going to go in front of Congress shortly. Eye-watering amounts of money. But for most countries like mine and like yours, that's not possible. And therefore, even America has a limited supply of stockpiles. And I think one of the really interesting questions that's cropped up over the last 18 days is that America has been using a lot of its air defense missiles to counter Iran's ballistic missile threat, because Iran had a lot of ballistic missiles. And although Trump said, we can quadruple the output of our defense industries, if you look at the rate of consumption of those missiles and the ability of American industries to, even if they quadruple the output, they can't keep pace. And even if I said, you're running a munitions factory, you're Lockheed Martin, and you're producing 17 Patriot missiles a week. If I say to you, right, next week, I want 60 of those missiles, not 17, you'll look at me and say, that's all jolly interesting, I'll take your money, but all the subcontractors, the people who make all the various sections, they can't suddenly sell me a load more. I don't have the factory big enough to build your 60. In a year's time, I'll be able to ramp up production, but I won't be able to do it in a week's time. So for Trump to say we can last forever, is just not true. I do think there are some weapons that America can churn out quickly. But I think this is less about cost for the cost of the war and more about numbers. Because in contrast, if America can produce 17 Patriots a week, my understanding is that Iran can produce about 5,000 Shaheeds every month. So it's much bigger production facility. So you've got to find a way of tackling that. Now, one of the reasons I think that the American campaign has been going so heavily after Iran's missile storage and also missile production is to stop Iran putting these things into the air. Because as soon as they put ballistic missiles into the air, you have to use an expensive missile to shoot it down. And they've used this term, do you catch the arrows or do you shoot the archer? And they're trying to take out these missiles before they get into the air. And I think that's probably quite wise.
From your perspective, why did they make this mistake in the matter of intercepting cheap drones? Did they underestimate this Iranian Shaheed drone technology? Ukraine has been defending its own country against these drones for years. Why didn't you just ask Ukraine for help beforehand, before the war began?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think let's take ourselves away from the Iranian war. Let's look at how does my country, the UK, prepare itself for the future. We have, ever since the Cold War ended, we've been involved in wars of choice. We've gone overseas. We've done expeditionary warfare. So we've gone to Iraq, we've gone to Afghanistan, we've gone to Bosnia, we've gone to Sarajevo. So we have a defence that's configured around taking our forces a distance away and then fighting. We have the aircraft carriers because they can then take our fighter jets because we know they're not under threat because the sort of wars we've been conducting against people that can't target our ships. But all of a sudden now you wake up and go, Russia's now invaded Ukraine. There's a very different threat. Now we are threatened here in the UK. And that's raised a huge number of questions that we've got a military that's not configured to defend the UK. It's configured to go and do expeditionary warfare. And that's led to a degree of panic. How big an army do we need? How do we create air defense systems? Do we configure air defense systems against a Shaheed drone threat or against a ballistic missile threat or against a small drone threat, or is it spider's web jumping out of ISO containers and coming onto it creates some really profound questions, and you can't afford to do all of it. Now, we as an island probably believe the ballistic missile threat is a major one because there are a lot of other countries that might shoot down Shaheeds before they got to us against our natural enemies. So for us, there's a lot of conversations going on with Ukraine and Poland about what lessons should we learn and how do we prepare. Now you take that to the Iran case, I think it's probably fair to say that most European countries didn't see Trump declaring war on Iran. And therefore, we weren't well prepared for that. It's also, I don't think many countries, even Trump, probably believed that Iran would attack its neighbours, which is a bit naive when you go, well, there's lots of US military bases around the region. If you've launched attacks from there, then that makes them targets. So I do think that there was a slight shock about the timing of this, the Iranian response to that, and therefore suddenly finding ourselves having to tackle Shaheed drones. But once again, even though we think they started the war with over 80,000 Shaheed drones, if you can take out the areas where they're stored, if you can take out the factories, and unlike Ukraine, we do have a lot of weapons, certainly the Americans do, and a lot of space-based detection systems and spies on the ground. I wouldn't underestimate how many of those have been brought to bear. Quite what stocks Iran still has, I don't know. Are we rushing to get out new capabilities helped by Ukraine? Yes, we are. But yes, it has been a bit of a reaction rather than planning for this eventuality.
If Vladimir Putin fires 500 or 1,000 Shaheed drones at United Kingdom, what will happen? What will you do?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, bluntly, at the moment, we don't have a defence against it. Now, don't forget, as you guys know better than I, if you lie on your back with a machine gun, you can shoot them out of the skies, but you've got to see them coming. Now that the original Shaheeds were petrol-driven propeller, I think some of the ones you're facing now have got little jet engines in them, so they go a little bit faster. Also, Russia's managed to change the colour of them and make them a bit more difficult for radars to pick up. They're getting more expensive, but they're also getting more capable. And I think that's going to raise a lot of questions about how do you configure the defences in your country. But I return to the theme that one of the themes I regularly talk about in interviews is that we have no defense against ballistic missiles in this country. And often the interviewers say, well, hang on a minute, Israel's got loads and Ukraine's got loads. And you go, right, who provides those? America. Providing with Patriot systems, with THAAD, or with Aegis. There's 3 main systems there. Israel's a very small country, so they can put an iron dome over the top of it. It's more difficult to protect the whole of Ukraine, but if you position some stuff around Kyiv and maybe Lviv. But honestly, nothing. And if a ballistic missile was fired towards London, we could track it, we could watch it, but we couldn't shoot it down. And that is a big shock to some people in this country. We used to have that capability. We don't today. And the British government has put £1 billion aside to look at missile defence. Do you know what a Patriot system costs? £1 billion. So that sounds like a lot of money, but you'd buy one Patriot system. Where would you put it in the UK? London. House of Parliament. Wembley. I'm a rugby fan. Let's call it Twickenham. I mean, it's a facetious, but it doesn't even touch the surface. It doesn't touch the sides of the sort of capability that we would need in this country. So it's going to take at least a decade of investment to get this country back ready to deter our nation's enemies. And that leaves us vulnerable. And that's a really big issue for this country.
Is also Europe and NATO ready for a war with Russia, against Russia?
Well, yes. And the only reason I say yes is because collectively NATO is incredibly powerful. If you look at the member nations of NATO, if you add up everything we've got, it's pretty impressive. And I look at, for example, Red Flag is a big exercise that's done in America, fighter jets. I've done it many times. And I know people are doing it regularly these days. You turn up there with your fighter jets, your squadrons bristling with capability, and you are with 100 other airplanes flying across a major bit of airspace to go and bomb a load of targets with real bombs. And you have Red Air, Americans flying all sorts of adversary aeroplanes. Day one, they shoot us all out of the sky. You go back to the bar that night feeling very sad. By the end of 2 weeks, you are getting through and you are completing the missions. The training we get in the West is second to none. We have some excellent equipment, some excellent people, fantastic technologies. And I'm very confident that the Russians have no answer to that at all. So, no, wouldn't just be about an air war, but the disadvantage for Ukraine is that you don't have a functioning air force that can deter the Russian adversary. Doing a great job with what you have, but you can't secure local air superiority or air control. I'm confident the West could do that, and that is something that would stop Russia in its tracks.
If we compare NATO's and Russia's military capabilities, what are Russia's chances against NATO in air war, air confrontation?
I don't think it would. I don't think it would survive well at all. One of the things that people get seduced by is air shows when you see an aeroplane. And the Russians have perfected all sorts of very clever maneuvers in an air show. One of them is a Cobra, where the aircraft goes up and then flops and then flies away. And you think, how does it do that? And it looks very impressive. But these days, air combat is not like Top Gun. It's not Tom Cruise fighting. We call it a knife fight in a phone box. It's not about tearing around the skies trying to shoot each other down. I keep hitting the microphone, sorry. It's actually about he who sees first wins. So I'm going to be 100 miles away from my Russian adversary. He's not even going to know I'm there. And there's a missile in the sky heading his way. It's not glamorous. It's not Top Gun. It's not warrior against warrior. It's technology, and it's very effective. And that is where the West has a huge advantage. The disadvantage is, as we've been talking about, the West doesn't have the appetite for casualties that Russia does. So Russia would want to draw you into a war on the battlefield. The West would want to use its technology to stop Russia in its tracks.
And if we compare F-35 jets, F-22 jets with Russia's Su-35 and the new models, what are the chances of Western aircraft against Russian in the sky?
Yeah, and I would follow the same path, is that the Russians have had a lot of problems developing their next generation platforms, and many of them have been delayed. What we see is some very good, a good look to the aeroplane, and it looks very agile, and it's a little bit stealthy. But the one thing that Russian aircraft have never been famous for is their technology. So a military fighter jet, the F-35 isn't that stealthy, but it's got an electronically scanned radar, which is very effective. The way it brings the information together so that the pilot can understand, not only from its sensors, but sensors from other platforms around. How you bring all of that together, because it's one pilot in the cockpit with an immense amount of details around him. That is where, so it's radars, it's electronic warfare, it's defensive countermeasures, all of those capabilities you can't see, but that's where the real combat teeth of an aircraft are. And that is an area which Russia has never been very good at. I've spent some time flying in an Mi-8 helicopter, for example, and the Mi-24s. And the one thing that's amusing is that they don't have any technology in them, but they're very rugged. They never break. So if you're going to be using them on a battlefield, we're very fragile because all of our aircraft are carbon fiber. It's not easy to repair them. Russian aircraft are just built really solidly. They're very reliable, but they don't have any technology, really. So that is the area where the West still has a massive advantage over Russia.
Do you consider Russia as a paper tiger in terms of equipment, capabilities, air power, ground forces also? Because Russia has lost 1.2, 1.3 million soldiers only in Ukraine, only in this war against Ukraine, not against NATO allies.
Yeah, I mean, the danger is that you take one element of their capability and you can be dismissive about it. The one huge strength that Russia has is combat experience. If you remember with Blitzkrieg in the Second World War, the Germans had combat experience. French forces didn't, British forces didn't, and the Germans just swept through. Russia and Ukraine, but Russia has a lot of combat experience now. On the offense, they've changed their tactics a lot, and I wouldn't underestimate that. The other thing that Russia's got is that soldiers win battles, but nations win wars. And what I mean by that is you need to get your defense industrial base spun up, because war is a whole of society enterprise. It's not just about the soldiers on the battlefield. You've got to get them the bullets. You've got to get them the guns. You've got to get them the missiles. You've got to replace the tanks. You've got to replace their body armor. That is a whole of society enterprise. And Russia has its economy on a war footing. It is generating the bullets, the guns, the missiles that it needs to win the war. The West hasn't done that yet. They've been talking about doing it for several years, but they've not done that yet. So there are a couple of areas where purely in terms of generating quantity and also with battlefield experience that Russia is dangerous. So I wouldn't call them a paper tiger, but there are distinct advantages the West has, and it would be absolute folly for President Putin to have a go at NATO.
How close are we to the Third World War right now?
I don't think we're very close at all. First of all, I think Iran is nothing to do with the World War. I think I would characterize Iran as being a really interesting case study. So where it links to Ukraine, if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, would Russia have invaded?
We don't think so, probably, in Ukraine.
I agree. But in 1994, America, the UK, Russia forced, persuaded, encouraged to sign the Budapest Memo and guarantee your security. 20 years later, Russia ignored it. Why is that important? It's important because the West has been quite effective at stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. They've been around since the end of the Second World War. Very few countries have them. Why is that? Because there has been a control mechanism to stop countries getting that technology. But if you look at Ukraine's example, these days, unless you're a major superpower, the only way to guarantee your sovereignty, the only way to guarantee that nobody will invade you, is if you have a nuclear weapon. So is it a great surprise that Iran wants to develop a nuclear weapon? Is it a great surprise that North Korea wants a nuclear weapon? And in fact, if you look around the world, 195 countries of the world, there's going to be a lot more of them that want nuclear weapons, because how do you guarantee your security otherwise? And I think that's one of the challenges that Russia, by invading Ukraine, and Iran's understandable desire to protect itself, but it's created a situation, particularly with Israel. We've not talked about Israel, but if Iran got a nuclear weapon, then that's an existential threat for Israel. And therefore, because America is the strategic guarantor of Israel, it had no choice but to say you can't have a nuclear weapon. You either talk about it, but if you talk about it and do nothing about it, we're going to stop you. And that's effectively what the war in Iran is about. So I don't think it's about nuclear war. Well, it can't be about nuclear war. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. And it's not about world war at all. I don't think world wars suit anybody these days. But I think the rules have changed. How can America criticize Russia for invading Ukraine when it goes into Venezuela and plucks the leader? If it goes into Iran without asking any of its partners, without going to the United Nations, without reference to any international law, and goes and invades another country or bombs another country, how does China assess that? What does China think, therefore, about going into Taiwan, as you mentioned earlier? And what does that mean for global security? You know, we've respected, whether you're a bigger nation or a small nation, whether you're America or you're a little island of the 195 nations that are around, you've all still had basic rights. People respect your sovereignty, respect your independence. If you're not one of the major powers, it feels like, as the Canadian Prime Minister said, you're on the menu. And therefore, how do nations protect themselves? I think that leaves UK. We left the European Union. If NATO is less robust than it used to be, what is the alliance that provides us with that security? When the war is over in Ukraine, what is the alliance that's going to guarantee your security, but also that of your neighbours? There's some profound questions that arise now as a result of these conflicts.
From your perspective, can U.S. use nuclear weapons against Iran? Trump has been talking about
No.
full devastation of Iran.
I'm pretty much very confident that America would never use nuclear weapons in Iran.
But they did it after the Second World War. Do you feel that they have?
How do you mean? You mean in Japan?
Yeah.
Right.
Don't you
Okay.
think that they have this? Yeah.
That's a completely. So again, we've got to be careful what lessons we draw from history. The Second World War, we'd seen 70 million people die. America had been drawn into the war. Japan was losing. The island hopping campaign meant that you knew how many soldiers you were going to lose, and the price for America to roll up Japan and force it to surrender was going to be a huge price in American lives. So the Japanese were given an ultimatum. They chose not to take it. First bomb went off. There's the ultimatum. They chose not to take it. Second bomb goes off. They signed. That was deliberately to go, we've saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. Japan, you know you're going to lose now, but the only way we can do that is cost of loads of American lives. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm not trying to justify it, but there was a particular set of circumstances there, and it did secure peace, and it did save a lot of American lives. I don't think we're looking at the same in Iran at all. I don't think America has a beef with the Iranian people. I think it's about stopping them having a nuclear weapon. And yeah, I don't think you need nuclear weapons to take out any targets in Iran.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has been threatening using nuclear weapons in Ukraine for a while. That said, from your perspective, don't you feel that Vladimir Putin has opened a Pandora box by invading Ukraine? Because after 2022, Hamas attacked Israel, U.S.-Israel war against Iran, Venezuela. What's your take on this?
Well, there's two questions there. One about nuclear weapons. The Pandora's box thing is an interesting one because some of these tensions, we see a peaceful world, but it's not peaceful. You know, the area of Kashmir is constantly being fought over. There's parts of the world where fighting continues to this day. Israel and the Palestinians, that has been a problem ever since the State of Israel was formed, and has never been resolved. Every now and again it erupts, and on that fateful day on the 7th of October when Hamas attacked Israel, yes, I think Israel's ever since that has seen that as an opportunity to, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to try and sort the region out. I think going back to your question about nuclear weapons though, Putin threatening the use of nuclear weapons, I think is, I'm grey-haired as a veteran of the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War, we lived under the omnipresent threat of nuclear holocaust. But we talked about it a lot. And we recognise that nuclear weapons, however abhorrent, however horrible they are, they will never be used. Because if they are used, the whole construct of mutually assured destruction means that everybody dies. Nobody wins. So they are the ultimate deterrent against your enemy attacking you, and it has worked. For 80 years it's worked. The problem is that because we have had 35 years now of not being in the Cold War, our military, our politicians, our public are not used to the language, the rhetoric that goes around nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons it's called the deterrent for a reason. Your nation's enemies have to be deterred from, and to do that, your nation's enemies have to believe that you would use the weapon. So I've got to stand there looking you in the eye, and you've got to believe that I would press that button. And that's how it works. So Putin rattling the cage that says, I might use nuclear weapons, is all part of that same philosophy. And what he's got to be matched by is that same philosophy from the West that says, you don't want to do that, Putin, because if you do, you know that you will launch an Armageddon. We will never let you get away with that. And despite the talk, that's why nuclear weapons works, because they'll never be used. And the one time that, was it the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both sides were escalating. And all of a sudden, there were some back channels opened up because they went, hang on a minute, neither of us actually want to go to nuclear war. It doesn't benefit either of us. How do we turn down the dials here? And that's exactly what happened. Putin is capitalizing on the fact that the West is not used to talking tough about nuclear weapons. We've got to learn to do that again.
Do you see this as Western weakness?
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe they're too concerned about their voters and polls and people, not to scare them. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it is. I think there are lots of things about the Cold War which we've got to wake up to. Another example where we're weak is in the Cold War, we didn't have troops at readiness. We didn't have ships at readiness. We were ready because you didn't know when you were going to be attacked. So we would have surprise exercises launched by NATO. Within 2 hours, we had to be at our jets with our kit bags ready to go into the field. We had to be able to operate, and that's whenever it happened, you didn't get any warning. And we've lost that capability now. So we've had, for example, we've got 2 aircraft carriers, but we can't keep one of them available all the time. We have 4 nuclear submarines so that we can have a continuous at-sea deterrent. There's always one at sea. It takes 4 submarines to do that. In the Royal Air Force, we have Typhoon aircraft available on quick reaction alert 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Whenever the warning goes up, there's a jet in the air. The aircraft carriers, they don't have enough to be available all the time. So they might be available, they might not be available. But that's about like having your fire brigade at home that's only available 2 or 3 days a week. You dial 999 and call for the fire brigade. Sorry, we're not available today. Well, that's no good, is it? And I think that's the transition that our military's got to get back to now. And that's a very different psychology. It's you're ready for war, not at readiness. Not in 2 or 3 months' time. Should it happen, we'll get ready for it. So there's lots of areas of this that we are not well prepared at the moment. That's not just about the equipment, it's how we use the equipment and the doctrine behind it.
And final question for you. Where is our world right now?
What do you mean by that?
I mean the global powers, conflicts, wars around the globe. And do you feel secured, safe today, taking into account that we have lots of wars going on? Ukraine-U.S. Israel war against Iran and possible other confrontations.
That's a great question. I think there are some youngsters today who would feel very scared. I don't. I think we have, for the last 35 years since the Cold War ended, I think we've kidded ourselves that there's no more bad guys, that there'll be no more wars. And there's rules of law, international rules of law. And we've watched as some countries haven't followed those, and we've said, hang on a minute, that's not right. We'll bring their ambassador in and send them a stiff letter. And gradually the world has unraveled around us. The United Nations, which was designed to create an opportunity to stop wars, Russia, a permanent member, invades another country which is directly in contravention of what the United Nations is all about. How can it possibly remain in the United Nations? How can it possibly retain its place on the Security Council? My point is that a lot of these institutions, NATO, United Nations, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, were invented at the end of the Second World War in an effort to stop another major war. But in the 80 years that's followed, things changed. And it feels like a lot of countries have abused those situations to capitalize for their own gain. And we have a saying in the UK, it feels like the emperor's new clothes, that we've kidded ourselves that, oh, well, we're going to stick to the rule of law. Why aren't you? Whereas this is a bit of a wake-up call that says, actually, things do change. There are some bad people in the world. We need to protect ourselves from that. We've lived for 35 years with the luxury of not having to spend much on defence. Those days are over. We need to prepare. And the best way to avoid war is to prepare for it. Because, as I found in the military, if you are standing on that wall, defending your nation, prepared to fight your nation's enemies, and if necessary, pay with your life for that, as long as you're professional and determined and credible, your nation's enemies won't take you on. We've got to return to that. And that transition will be painful because we haven't got the money. It'll mean other priorities have to change. But in a way, it gives me reassurance that actually we do need to get ourselves back, find our way. We left the European Union, we're an island nation, and now we feel very vulnerable. I think there's some positives to take away, but we've got to take action.
Thank you, Sean, for your insightful answers and great podcast today, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Heroyam Slava. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Fantastic, gents. Good job.
Phew. 81 minutes. Holy shimoly.